When Putin sees he can gain an inch, he's apt to take a mile. And basically, if America's not going to give him any pushback, I think he's going to continue to try to expand Russian influence. If we had a policy which was firm, which armed Ukraine with defensive and offensive weapons so that they could defend themselves, I think Putin would make different calculations. If you had a Reagan-esque policy of strength, I think you'd see people like Putin not want to mess with us.
That was how Ron DeSantis used to talk about Russia and Ukraine. During Russia's 2014 invasion of Crimea, DeSantis was still a member of Congress sitting on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And he used his position at the time to do what most Republicans did back then, which was stake out hawkish positions against Russian aggression and blame the Obama White House for not being strong enough, for being weak and not doing enough to arm Ukrainians in that fight. But that was then. And now Ron DeSantis is a potential contender in the Republican nomination for president. He is running in a party whose base has all but embraced Vladimir Putin and abandoned its support for Ukraine. So now when Ron DeSantis gets asked about Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, he says things like this.
I don't think it's in our interest to be getting into proxy war with China getting involved over things like the borderlands or over Crimea. The fear of kind of Russia going into NATO countries and all that and steamrolling, that has not even come close to happening.
DeSantis' evolution on the issue is part of a growing trend within the Republican Party. While some in the GOP have maintained support for Ukraine, there is growing momentum among conservatives who've begun openly advocating to abandon Ukraine in this fight. Congressman Matt Gaetz has introduced a resolution that would end all military and financial aid to Ukraine. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is now an ally of House Republican leadership, she has called for Biden's impeachment over his visit to Ukraine earlier this week. And yesterday, Donald Trump released a video for his supporters, claiming that World War III has never been closer than it is right now, and vowing to clean the house of all the warmongers and America Last globalists in the deep state, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the National Security Industrial Complex. Joining us now is Julia Ioffe, Washington correspondent and founding partner at Puck News. Julia, it's great to see you.
Hi, good to see you, Alex.
So my question is how the evolution of the GOP on the fight in Ukraine. There was a moment, and it was a short-lived moment, when there seemed to be some version of bipartisan support for this at the outset of all of it. And I wonder what you think the catalyst for the chilled enthusiasm, which is putting it mildly, inside the GOP, what the catalyst was for that. Was it just, is it the length of the war? Is it the fact that Biden seems to be somewhat successful in his strategy? Is it just isolation? Isolationism is an inevitable end point of the modern day GOP. I mean, what do you attribute it to?
I think it's important to point out that I think it's still a mainstream position in the Republican Party to support Ukraine. And I was just at the Munich Security Conference, and there were a lot of Republicans, both senators and House members from the Republican side of the aisle, who were there pledging their support. Some of them pretty high-ranking members pledging to, quote, die on this hill, because it reminded them of the struggle of World War II, that it was such a clean-cut battle of good versus evil. As for what's happening on the far right wing of the party, I think it has several explanations. One is the kind of as American as apple pie isolationism that runs strong in American politics from the very beginning of our republic. Part of it is Trump's embrace of Russia, and the fact that Russia, during his administration, was seen more as a friend, in part because Russia tried to help him win the election and definitely put their thumb on the scale during the 2016 presidential election. Putin also very ably inserts himself into our culture wars. Even on yesterday, when he delivered his address to the Federal Assembly, he again invoked a lot of our culture war issues. And I think part of it is done to insert himself into the American culture wars, talking about how the war is being waged so that kids don't have a parent number one and a parent number two, but so that they have a mother and a father, and so that Ukrainians can't push queer values onto Christian Russia. I think that really resonates with Republicans. I think, especially on the far right. I think what's interesting is that on this part of the far right, they're very uncomfortable taking the fight to Vladimir Putin, in part because he's a white nationalist Christian leader in their eyes, but they're very comfortable taking the fight to China. And I wonder what the difference is.
I hear what I mean, and there's no question that there are some establishment figures inside the GOP that are very much publicly voicing their support for Ukraine. But, you know, if you look at Republican support for providing weapons for Ukraine, for example, in May of last year, 53% of Republicans wanted to provide that support. January of this year, that's shrunk to 39%. So it seems like, for all the reasons you outlined, this sort of semi-pro-Putin rhetoric is really having its effect on the grassroots part of the base. And I wonder, Putin's a very shrewd operator. The fact that he's taking a page from the culture war playbook is the way you maintain that support with the far right wing of the Republican Party. What is Zelensky's play in all of this? Because he certainly can't come out as a woke liberal, and he should not have to. But I mean, how do you combat that if that's what Putin's trying to do? Because they both have to care at this point a lot about American domestic politics, because it could determine in some part the future of this war.
Well, I think that's why you saw Zelensky coming to Congress in late December and saying, this isn't charity. And I can account for what you have sent us. And what you are sending us is helping us win this fight. And it's keeping the fight on our lands and not bringing the war to you. I mean, the constant lobbying, both public and private, that Ukrainians are doing is very important, because you're right. This erosion of support in the Republican base is very concerning. Pretty much everybody quoted this poll at the Munich Security Conference in private, and Europeans were very worried about it, and Americans had to go out of their way to reassure our European allies, because unfortunately, as much as Europe is committed to this fight, they really still need America to lead them and to unify them, to kind of herd their cats, as it were. And everybody is very worried on the other side of the Atlantic. What happens if Joe Biden isn't reelected? What happens if the congressional makeup changes yet again and the people on the far right gain more power? Or if people in the American public turn actively hostile against Ukraine? I think right now, if it's an issue that's still kind of, people are basically support Ukraine, but don't really pay a ton of attention to it, it shouldn't be too hard to get aid through, maybe not in the same massive quantities that the Biden administration was able to get it through in the first year. But it is going to be a lot harder, and it's definitely something that the Biden administration is conveying to their Ukrainian counterparts, that the aid packages are just not going to be the size that they were in 2022.
The domestic politics have a massive effect on what is playing out in Ukraine, and we are all watching them carefully. Julia Ioffe, my friend, it's good to see you. Thanks for your time tonight.